Hello, I'm Jim Mustick at Iona University, and I am delighted to be here in conversation today with Tom Chatfield, author of Wise Animals, How Technology Has Made Us What We Are, and many other wonderful volumes and blog posts, Substacks, and so on. He is a leading thinker in technology today, and as part of our Presidential Speaker Series, sponsored by the Gabelli Center for Teaching and Learning at Iona, Tom is addressing the community tonight. And we thought we'd have a little sidebar conversation with him about some of the themes that we are engaged with here at Iona, such as how education can address this AI moment and how the power of the AI tools can be used for the enhancement of teaching and learning and all of the good things we do week in and week out here on campus. Tom, welcome to New Rochelle.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's great to be here.
I'm going to give you a sentence from your book, and we'll start there.
And I have to tell you where it's from.
We think through and with our creations, and they shape not just what we can do, but who we are. Your work, in my experience, is, if not singular, rare in focusing not on the distinction between the human and the technological, but how the two are in a constant conversation.
That's right, yeah. And it's partly, I guess, because I have a background in literature and philosophy. I'm passionately interested in technology. But it seems to me that one of the most important things we can recognize about technology is that it's not just stuff out there in the world, gadgets that we pick up and put down. It is part of who we are in the most literal of senses. In fact, technology predates the emergence of our species. We are who we are because our ancient ancestors harnessed fire and flint tools, because they uniquely developed a survival strategy based upon the manipulation and control of their environment. And so when I talk about technology, the first thing I want to do really is emphasize that each one of us, each new child, is born into prehistory, but then taught a way out. The stuff of the human-made world that surrounds us, language, screens, clothes, glasses, air conditioning, cameras, all of this vast inheritance is part of who we are as human beings. And what follows from this is that if we want to have a kind of rich, humane conversation about how to use technology well, how to use it to enhance our potentials and so on, we really need to pay very close attention to the values, the affordances that it enacts, and to what it encourages us to be, to this negotiation between the human and the technological.
Another thing you say in the book is our thoughts have always lived partly outside us. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's right, yeah. You're going straight for my most philosophical bits. So I'm very influenced by the philosophers Dave Chalmers and Andy Clark, who a couple of decades ago now wrote a very prescient paper about the extended mind. And what they meant by this phrase was simple, but at the time radical. It was the claim that a technology like a calculator, like a book, like me using writing to scribble notes for this interview or to write down your phone number, this is not just something out there. If it is enacting a part of cognition like memory or computation, it is in a sense part of our minds. That to be human is to have a mind that extends beyond our body. And in fact, in the most obvious sense, I'm talking to you with words. Mm-hmm. We understand each other. Hopefully the audience understands us. I didn't make these words. They are a vast inheritance, a communal activity, a technology. And they allow me to think, to communicate, to deal in concepts, to interact with the world in ways that would be quite impossible if I didn't possess language. Mm-hmm. Similarly, my mobile phone, I'm in New York. I'm from London. It's not a city I know well. But with my GPS, with my Google search, with my Google Translate, with the thousands upon thousands of works and items of information created by others and shared online, I have an extraordinary ability to navigate the city or anywhere else on Earth. And that phone is part of my mind when I outsource aspects of my cognition of memory to it. This outsourcing is something we constantly do, and it's a very ethically fraught process because, of course, it begs the question, well, what should we outsource? What shouldn't we outsource? How should we outsource it? And when we do this, how can we retain a sense of kind of control, of agency, of critical engagement?
Let's take that point and look at some of the things we're trying to do here at Iona in terms of teaching and learning. Obviously, AI is much in the news and on everyone's minds these days. And one can think of it as something outside ourselves, and how much should we outsource, how much should we rely on it. But I think part of what, if I understand correctly, some of your approach to this is that it's not this either-or situation where you are just relying on the AI or outsourcing something to the AI. It is actually another technology that we use the way that we can use, the way we have used technologies in the past, that we the border is porous between the two. There's a wonderful chemistry professor here at Iona named Sung-Hee Lee, who's quite brilliant as a researcher and a teacher. And she works in an area of studying cells and the soft interface that substances can pass through to get into the cell. That's the extent of my chemical knowledge. I rely on it as a metaphor because I think a lot of learning is a similar kind of management of a soft interface between our minds and the material, our minds and the technology, and so on. So what are your thoughts on artificial intelligence in the context of how much we can rely on it, how much we should rely on it? What are the ethical considerations there?
So I think this idea of a permeable border is very useful. The philosopher and psychologist Alison Gopnik talks about large language models, that particular subset of AIs that talk to us, as social technologies. And what she means by this is that they are, to some degree, intelligent and smart and powerful precisely because they are pooling millions upon millions of human works and words and observations. They're like, the library to end all libraries, the ultimate stochastic echo chamber. So when we talk to them, what we get back is a statistically plausible extrapolation of our words, or to put it in less grand ways, we get a reply that is not necessarily completely accurate, but is a kind of averaged response based upon vast, almost inconceivable amounts of human utterance and creation. And this is a very strange thing because we've been trained by science fiction, I'm looking at you, Star Trek, to think of computers as strictly logical arenas that give us answers, databases and so on. But we have something much softer and stranger with AI. We have a sort of echo chamber into which we can shout and we can hear back kind of possible answers and riffs on our own words. And the key word here, I think, is dialogue. When I go to an AI tool and I just ask it a question and it gives me an answer, in a way I'm utterly failing to make use of its potentials. And I'm in a dangerous situation, ethically, because its answer will almost certainly be plausible, but it may or may not be reality-based. It may be what's sometimes called a hallucination, which is a rather anthropomorphic word, but what it really means is just something that is logical or reasonable or probable in terms of the data, but doesn't necessarily correspond to reality. But, to go to the point you made, if instead I go to an AI, and for example I say, hey, I'm really interested in trying to come up with a way to explore AI with my students in a workshop, I want to get them playing with it. What might a workshop like that look like? Can you sketch an outline? Oh, by the way, I think it's really important that they are hands-on with an AI, but also having lots of conversations in and amongst themselves. And what it will say is, sure, here's a little outline. And I'll read that through, and it will probably be a very good kind of impression of this kind of document. But then critically, the next step I take is not saying, well, that's the answer, this is the perfect platonic way to do this. I'll say, well, okay, that's great, but look, here's a bit more context. I'm particularly going to deal with students from two different disciplines, from business studies and from healthcare. And I want this to only last an hour. And I want there to be a really good exercise at the start, a really good prompt. Can you think of that? And then it will do that, and so on. And gradually, if I'm doing it right, what will happen is that I will engage in a critically reflective process in the light of this sort of strange, probabilistic, vast resource. But the crucial point is that it's my questioning and reflection and re-reflection that really takes this process and makes it valuable. And I am, in a way, thinking rather as I do when, as a writer, I write something and then I read it through with my pen in my hand and I scribble in the margins and I say, well, hang on a second, Tom, that's boring, that's wrong, that's too abstract, that's irrelevant. And so my model for AI could be summed up, I suppose, by the idea that we live in an age when almost any question we think of can be answered instantly and plausibly by this vast kind of probabilistic system, this crazy black box. But what that means is not then that our work is done as educators and as thinkers and as citizens handed over to the machines. It puts an enormous onus on us to ask the right questions, to question our questions, to do the thing that only human thinkers can do, which is think about, well, what are we trying to achieve in the first place? Why is this worth achieving? As educators, as institutions, what are we trying to do? What do I want my students to get out of this? Why? What's important? What should I be worried about? And if we arm ourselves with that approach, then I think we can demystify these incredibly powerful tools.
It also suggests that AI is not antithetical to critical thinking. It's actually a prompt towards it.
Certainly can be. And I think here there's a lot of dangers with, I guess, kind of, I was going to say Manichaean thinking. That sounds very obscure, but with the desire to tell a story in which AIs are either going to save us or condemn us to a sort of dystopian world. We have a sort of mythologized attitude towards these technologies. And actually, instead, we can be critically reflective thinkers. You say, well, these are crazy new tools. I don't fully understand them. I'm not sure anybody does. We don't know how far they'll go. We don't know how fast they will take us to new places. But if we keep our wits about us, then we absolutely can play with them, test their limits. What, practically speaking, one of the best and most interesting things you can do with an AI is have a chat to it about something you know a lot about or care about, and test really the limits of its knowledge as well as its strengths. I encourage children sometimes to talk to them about video games, about Pokemon, about their local town, about stuff they really know about. And then you start to realize that even this miraculously vast system has its limitations, its bugs, and its features, and its strengths. And so critical thinking, at root, begins with the awareness that you don't yet know everything there is to be known. It begins with pausing in doubt. And so the key question that follows from that is, well, are you using the tools at your disposal, including large language models, but also search engines, databases, textbooks, even, if you like, the resources at your disposal being a faculty, a campus, a university, your peers? Are you using those to do your thinking for you, to try and just get a grade and get on and not have to worry about thinking and self-reflection? Or are you using them to try and explore your own learning needs, to try and increase your capacities as a reflective seeker of insight and understanding, as someone who reflects upon the business of thinking and the creation of knowledge? And this question is becoming really important because it's incredibly easy to treat AI as an answer box, because it will spit out an answer at high speed with great fluency. And psychologically, we are very prone, we're very vulnerable as organisms to treating speed and fluency as synonymous with truth. And in fact, quite the reverse is true. If something is, as it were, really plausible, really quick and really simple, it's almost certainly wrong. And the challenge is to find out how and why it is.
The technologist and tech philosopher Jaron Lanier said something about the web years ago, that it remembers everything while forgetting its context. And I think when it comes to plausible outputs from AI with its enormous reach, and when it comes to critical thinking, the question of context is really important. And to have a sense of context requires a grounding in whatever field you're looking at, as you suggested by saying it's instructive to have a dialogue with the AI about something you know a lot about. Talk about context a little bit, its relation to critical thinking and our engagement with these kinds of tools.
I'm glad you've mentioned Jaron's work, because I think in particular his book, You Are Not a Gadget,
Yes.
Has stood the test of time remarkably well. He's a very interesting person. He sort of co-invented virtual reality. He's also a great musician, a great collector of esoteric musical instruments, a great performer. And he makes the point in that book that certain amounts of context don't translate at all into the digital world and become invisible. The smell of something, the texture of something, what it's like to hold it in your hands, its sort of origin in the world, what it feels in a bodily sense to be somewhere. And this is non-trivial. And the decontextualization of information is incredibly important, because it means, if you like, that the translation of something from a kind of historical, embodied, worldly context into a kind of digital context is potentially wrenching away precisely those things we need in order to understand it critically. So let's be precise about this, because I think it's a very important point. And in a way, I think it's the most important counterpoint to the potentials of AI. Let's say I'm writing a book or researching a paper, and let's say I'm writing about the history of artificial intelligence. Now, if I ask an AI about it, it will probably point me towards the Dartmouth Summer Conference on AI back in the 1950s when the term was coined. It will probably point me towards certain papers and breakthroughs that occurred through the 50s and 60s, the AI winters, the new summers, the great Transformers paper that heralded the current era, and so on and so on and so on. But crucially, a little bit like using Wikipedia, what I do next, what I should do next, is go to these sources and start delving into them, because of course what I will be told about them is to some degree the average of the average account.
Mm-hmm.
It will be the kind of thing that everybody always says about these things. I am sick of going to tech conferences and seeing a slide about the Gutenberg press. Like, there's about two things that everybody seems to know about the Gutenberg press: that it happened in the 15th century and that it changed the world. And that's the average of the average take, and maybe it proves that technology is great or something. It's so much more interesting if you go back to Gutenberg's life, if you go back to his struggles to kind of repurpose a wine press, to find the right blend of inks, and so on. And similarly with these papers, one of the wonderful things you can do online is you can go back and find a scan of the original invitee list to the Dartmouth conference. You can see who didn't turn up. You can see around the sort of margins of the decontextualized, you can go and perhaps look up some accounts of people reminiscing about this. You can go back to scans of these original papers. Here's another silly little example. There's a famous paper by Abraham Wald from the Second World War. He researched it in the US about survivorship bias. And it's become an iconic paper because of an image of an aircraft with dots showing on this image where bullets hit it. And Wald's great insight, which is absolutely true, is that if you want to prevent your aircraft being shot down, you need to reinforce them where there are no bullet holes on the returning aircraft. Because what that tells you is that any aircraft that was shot down in one of those places never made it home. So the aircraft that matter most in terms of your thinking are the aircraft that lie smashed into pieces across the battlefields of Europe, and that placing reinforcements to armour on places with lots of bullet holes and returning aircraft is exactly wrong. However, that diagram was not in the original paper. Wall didn't draw it. His original paper is a masterpiece of first principles statistical reasoning, which you can find a scan of online, which doesn't use most of the formulae that are used when talking about it these days and doesn't have any diagrams in because those formulae didn't exist. He had to do it from first principles. He just counted stuff on fuselages. The original paper is much more interesting than the stuff that's said about it. And the story of how Wald came to write it and how he came to be in Canada and then in America is much more interesting. I'm getting excited. So, in a nutshell, the AI can help us explore ideas, but just like a Wikipedia article, the value we add, our ability to have, if you like, a relationship with what actually happened, with what actually was said and thought at a time, with where it resides in the world, that is absolutely about our ability not to take the average of the average, but to go deeply into the particularities of something. And in some ways, I think, at its best, what technology offers to researchers and thinkers and innovators is the opportunity to combine incredibly wide questioning and research with incredibly meticulous engagement with the particularities of events. And if you miss either of those stages out, you're at the great risk of sounding just like something generated by AI, and thus of adding no value whatsoever yourself.
Yeah. We often talk about the features of a new technology, and we focus on them incessantly, to the detriment of conversations about the features of the human mind that can be equally powerful and that are part of the substance of any intelligence we bring to the world, whether it's the intelligence that's the underlying intelligence informing the AIs or as we move through the world. And it's a little related to the sense of context, but a mind, at least to date, is attached to a body. That body is moving through the world in a time and a place, which supplies its own sense of context for things. What about that kind of feature of human intelligence do you think is important as we engage with disembodied intelligences?
So I think this is another sense in which context is incredibly important. To quote the late, great Danny Kahneman, you think with your body, not only with your brain. And this is incredibly obvious if in the crudest sense you say, well, there are plenty of people in the world who are in situations of dire need, of trauma, of physical distress, of danger, of malnutrition, and so on. And these are not facts that are detachable from their thinking, their feeling. In fact, you could make a stronger case than this. You could say that because ultimately the value of anything we believe or do or wish to bring about resides in a human experience, it's ultimately these, if you like, this kind of bodily, emotive, sensorial bedrock that underpins things. Why do we want the economy to grow? Why do we want to innovate? Why do we want companies to grow? Well, perhaps to make money for people, but why do they want money? Well, on some level, it has to come down to a life, to a individual human, to the experience of a human. Imagine a world in which all the humans had died, but all the companies were run by AIs and were fantastically productive. Is that a world in which value exists, in which it's good that the economy grows? Imagine an economy that grows by 100% because it produces vast amounts of pollution and waste, and then there's another huge industry that tidies up that pollution and waste. But interestingly, I'd like to challenge the idea of AIs as disembodied, because I think this is wrong.
Huh.
In fact, if we think about AIs in general, we're missing a trick, because we should be talking about a specific AI run by a particular company, a particular geography, a place in the world, and some servers located somewhere, subject to particular laws, dependent upon an infrastructure of energy, dependent upon data. It's trying to make money for someone or something. It has shareholders. Data went in, inputs come out. Nowhere is it disembodied. In fact, They would like you to think, a lot of people, that the cloud genuinely is a cloud. If we replace the word cloud with energy-hungry server bunker, we get closer to the truth. And there's not AI out there in some general sense. There are AIs. The frontier systems being created in California by private corporations are very different to those being created in China, are very different to the systems being created in other parts of the world. So again, I think context is king. And to pick just one very important small point, the energy consumption of AIs is an enormously important consideration in terms of carbon, in terms of emissions, in terms of the world, the amounts of water and power they require. And to treat this as abstract is to forget that when we query an AI, we are, quite literally burning up money and resource in order to do so.
Let's stay on this for a while, because I think you raise a good point that is often lost when we talk about AIs in general, or the subject of artificial intelligence in general. What we are seeing are the productization of a capability. That productization has certain financial imperatives to continue to be developed and survive, and it kind of colors our picture of what the potential of the technology may be, and also argues toward a specific type of inevitability that really is not a function of the technology as much as of the product that is bringing it to us.
Exactly right. People worry about AI taking jobs or taking over the world. But of course, no AI wakes up and says, I'm going to make a bunch of people redundant, whereas plenty of chief executives do. And in a way, the pretense that AI is something that has a kind of will of its own, a mind of its own, that is on some kind of inevitable technological track towards the future, is an abnegation of responsibility or a distraction from the rather more interesting fact that certain firms are making certain products, seeking funding, having certain marketing spiels. It's very difficult to disentangle the hype from the product because, among other things, hype is also the product of a lot of AI firms because they need to raise staggering amounts of money. A lot of firms are going to go bust. I'm old enough to remember when the internet was inevitably going to make the entire world democratic and free. That didn't work out too well.
Not yet, no.
Not yet. We're still waiting for that one. So the claim that something automatically and inevitably follows from any technology is really just a piece of hand-waving that distracts from more interesting, important questions, which is like, well, what are the propensities of this technology? What are the people running it and paying for it doing and wanting? What does and doesn't it disrupt? And also, we are already seeing a huge, I think, kind of legislative process of self-reflection about what we want from AI, about what we don't want from AI. I don't know where this is going to end, but I do know that, as with all other technologies, it's not just about technology doing stuff to us. It's about us collectively, as nations, as individuals, as corporations, entering into this sort of negotiation with the potentials of technology, with its threats, with its perceived threats. Now, of course, this negotiation power is distributed very unequally, but that doesn't mean that the future is already written. And I guess so the one thing I would always implore people to do is to try to disregard hype-driven narratives, to try and set those aside and saying, okay, well, who owns this? What do they want? Where's their money come from? What can and can't it do today? What is the range of possible outcomes? And which of these outcomes do I want to live in? Mm-hmm. Which of these... So, for example, AI is very good at creating images and fluent writing and increasingly video and things like that. But to say that, therefore, all our books will be written by AI and our TV programs generated by AI and every story just generated on the fly by an AI ignores the fact that people, broadly speaking, don't want to read stories written by AI. They don't want their stories to be machine generated by algorithm. Sometimes they do for some purposes, but a lot of the time we tell stories and listen to stories and buy art and share stories because we're deeply, deeply interested in what other human beings think and feel and have to say about the world. We want to direct our money and interest towards human creativity, towards human artistry, towards human performance. We want to feel a connection. And the fact that technology can produce an extremely good impression of Taylor Swift does not mean that therefore nobody cares about Taylor Swift and nobody is bothered about what she does and everybody will be fine to have iTaylor instead of her. That's self-evidently absurd, and it also applies down to the microcosm. So whenever someone says, well, it can do this, therefore there's no need for that, I instinctually reach for a consideration of, well, hang on a second. Why do people actually do this? What do we actually want and need and care about?
I think there's also, in terms of creative work, an aspect of human expression that is as connected to our experience as touch and feel and the other things you were talking about. And that in order to make a meaning, something meaningful, through expression relies on that the creator actually having the urge to that utterance, which may not be something that the machines can deliver.
Well, that's exactly right, and I would go further than that. There's the old saying, how do I know what I think until I say it?
Yes.
And part and parcel of this is the fact that we are not anything like machines in our cognition. We don't just receive inputs, process them, and then produce outputs, which might imply that then you can take humans out of the loop and just replace us. When it comes to education, for example, if I think about my own children who are 9 and 11 years old, when they come home and show me a story or a poem they've written or a picture they've drawn of our cat, I don't look at what they've done and say, that's rubbish. Why are you bothering with that? That's stupid. You don't need to do that anymore. Look, here's ChatGPT, here's Claude, here's Gemini, here's Stable Diffusion. Type a prompt into that. It'll draw a brilliant image of a cat. You don't need to bother me with your rubbish drawing and your boring, unoriginal writing and your silly poems. Because self-evidently, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds are not writing stories and drawing pictures of cats in order to fill the world with cat-related content. They're doing it because the gradual process of being educated and learning to become a member of society, to gain the capacity for self-expression, self-reflection, to communicate with others, to learn to relate to the world of words and ideas and space and beauty and so on, is about doing and trying and reflecting. And this applies to all human beings of all ages. If we think about an institution like Iona, if we think about how it is producing people who are well equipped to go into the world, to know themselves, to find work, to find meaning, to participate in their society, this needs to be people who have not just produced outputs that prove they have a certain amount of knowledge or that they can prompt an AI. People who have the capacity to reflect upon the meaning of words, to join in a debate about priorities, democracy, health, value, liberty, who have developed taste, who have things they love, who are able to communicate with other human beings and share reflections upon their inner lives, and so on, and so on, and so on. And to do that at some level, you have to be someone who has struggled and wrestled with the business of self-expression, research, thinking, skill. It doesn't mean that using AI to produce outputs is bad, that there's no place for it at all. But it does mean that I think it's very, in a way, obviously silly and wrong to advance the argument that cutting humans out of these loops is cost-free, because it completely misunderstands what it means for us to learn to be ourselves, to think, to participate in society, to relate to one another.
You published a short essay on Substack, I think it was in February of this year, called How to Have a Conversation with a Book, which is a lovely piece of writing. And in it, you talk about, the framework of the piece is you have the manuscript of a friend's book, and you're making notes and having a kind of conversation with the manuscript and with your friend as you're going through this. And what comes out in that, as you go through it, is the sense that that kind of active engagement with a book, that conversation, is as important in realizing the potential of the text that you're reading as the text itself. And as we talk about self-expression and learning how to make meaning and all of those things, it strikes me that perhaps one way to look at beneficial uses of AI is actually to look at it as something that we can have a dialogue with directly for the same purposes of discovery and learning.
I think dialogue is a great model. And once we embrace it, I think it opens up some really interesting spaces. Because, of course, an AI is inhuman, and that can be liberating in certain powerful ways. There's quite a lot of research showing that talking to an AI can have great therapeutic value. And I think as long as you don't believe that the AI is your friend, I can see a lot of benefit in this, because you can confide in a machine that is infinitely patient, that will never, one hopes, judge you harshly. You can know yourself better through speaking. When we talk about having a conversation with a book, I think the really important point here is that the meaning of a text is not just something that sort of exists inside it like a number, and that anybody who reads it can get this number. The meaning of this book is 57, and anyone who reads it correctly will take away 57. We'll all agree that book meant 57, this book means 63. Of course not, that's absurd. The meaning is something we make. The meaning is something we remake. To reread a book as a young person, as an older person, is to encounter two different versions of the text. For me as a student, it was a bit of a light bulb moment when I started to sort of give myself permission to argue with books in the margins, to scribble and say, oh, no, I'm not sure what that means, or really, or are you sure, or because I was learning how to get more out of the encounter with the text. So I do think this is a great model for technology, because then the question becomes a pragmatic one. How can I get the most out of this interaction, this opportunity? And it doesn't have to be a fixation upon there's one right answer and one meaning and one result, and the project is to come up with the perfect essay, to come up with the final answer, to get the 57 and the 69 and put them all down. Quite the reverse. The project is developing and demonstrating understanding of various kinds, but it's also perhaps cultivating your interest. It's also perhaps discovering what is meaningful and purposeful and interesting to you, and what resonates for you and how you want to work, and so on and so on. If we're very pragmatic about AI as just another opportunity to be in dialogue with knowledge and understanding, then maybe we can get past, I think, this enormous barrier of anthropomorphism. And the last thing I'd say is that in some ways, one of the huge opportunities, I think, of just being in conversation with resources is it can get you past the dangerous idea that there is a single, final, authoritative answer, that the text you're reading, that your professor, that the thing you're studying has one final answer forever and ever, and that's it. Because even if there are certain facts about the world that are true and important, what those facts mean, what we should do with those facts, how we should mobilize them into arguments, what other facts they connect to. These are always questions for negotiation and debate and revisiting. And if AI can help educators and education systems get beyond the idea that just regurgitating rote knowledge is a good model for education, and that people shouldn't take an interest in how knowledge and understanding are made, if we can get towards the idea that all of us collectively are trying to build understanding and knowledge and test our ideas, then I think that is potentially a great gift of knowledge mobilized in this way.
That's wonderfully said, and I think a apt place to conclude. Tom Chatfield, thank you for coming to New Rochelle to speak and for sitting down for this podcast. And I recommend to any of you listening Tom's work, which is available widely, particularly his most recent book, Wise Animals, How Technology Made Us What We Are.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. How do we do?